Okay, I'll hand over to you, Nat.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Wright. I'll be chairing the panel today, which means that I have the wonderful job of introducing our three incredible speakers today. And this is just a note before we start. I can see everybody sending in lovely messages in the chat. And we're hoping that if you have any questions for the Q&A, that you might be able to put them into the Q&A section, just in case they get lost in the chat. So feel free to use both functions, but we do request that you include any questions just to pop them into the Q&A section. So I will first introduce our first speaker, Janine Chirios. She is an American artist who uses textile techniques alongside natural and organic materials to explore the complex and tenuous relationship between humans and the natural world. While her oeuvre includes installation, photography, and sculptural works, she is best known for her intricately crafted leaves stitched entirely with human hair. The work of Janine Chirios has been exhibited widely, both nationally and internationally, and included in the exhibitions at Centraal Museum in Utrecht, Netherlands, Musée Jean Lursatet de la Tapisserie Contemporaine in Angers, France. I have to practice my French as a Canadian there. Museo de l'Art Fabril et del Coltellerie in Maniago, Italy, Museum Miasta Gdynia in Gdynia, Poland, the Montreal Centre for Contemporary Textiles in Montreal, Canada, and Long Beach Museum of Art in Long Beach, California. Her work has also been featured in the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, Frame magazine, and Mary Chaucer's publication, Textiles, The Art of Mankind. Janine Chirios is a recipient of the Massachusetts Cultural Council Fellowship in Crafts and the Rogers Fellowship for Textile Arts at the Hamage Center in Rabun Gap, Georgia. She is currently a visiting lecturer in the Fibers Department at Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston, Massachusetts. And then in the second presentation that we'll hear today, we'll be blessed to hear from Dr. Beverly Gordon and Lisa Binkley. Beverly Gordon is a professor emeritus in the Design Studies Department, University of Wisconsin-Madison. She was also a faculty associate in the Folklore and Women's Studies programs at UW, and was one of the initiators of the Interdisciplinary Material Culture Certificate Program. For close to 30 years, she taught classes on textiles, fashion, and cross-cultural design history and appreciation and material culture analysis. Gordon's involvement in the textile field is longstanding. She served on the board of the Textile Society of America for 10 years and was the president of the organization from 1998 to 2000. Her numerous publications have been highly influential. One of her early books, Shaker Textile Arts, is still in print after 40 years. Textiles, The Whole Story, Uses, Meanings, Significance is a comprehensive overview, otherwise called The Fiber of Our Lives, Why Textiles Matter. Other titles include The Saturated World, Aesthetic Meaning, Women's Lives, 1890 to 1940, and Felt Making, Uses, Meanings, and Contemporary Explorations. Her articles include The Hand of the Maker, The Importance of Understanding Textiles from the Inside Out, and Women's Domestic Body, The Conceptual Conflation of Women and Interiors in the Industrial Age. She remains a sought-after reviewer for professional journals such as Design and Culture, Dress through the Costume Society of America, and Textiles and Clothing Research Journal. Beverly Gordon is also a participating artist. She has worked with many fiber techniques, weaving, felt making, embroidery, hooking, etc. In the last 2 decades, she developed a unique body of work consisting primarily of collage and assemblage sculpture that incorporates textiles and natural detritus, such as bones, pods, and shells. Some of this work was featured in Reconfigured, a solo exhibition at the Design Gallery in 2013. And last but not least, Lisa Binkley holds a BS in Textiles and Design from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's in Urban Planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Formerly a public policy analyst, she has maintained an active fiber art studio since 2000 and has been teaching fiber art workshops since 2007. Her award-winning artwork has been selected for national and international exhibitions, including those of the American Quilters Society, the International Quilt Association, Craft Forums, Crafts National, QSDS, Wisconsin Arts Biennia, and many others. Lisa and her artwork have been featured on local and national television and in internationally distributed books and magazines. Her art is represented in public, private, and corporate collections. Lisa enjoys sharing her passion for fiber art through her artwork, classes, and lectures, and she teaches throughout the US and internationally. She and her husband, artist Ed Binkley, have 2 young adult children, and Lisa and Ed live in the woods in Madison, Wisconsin with their big fluffy dog, which I think sounds absolutely lovely. So I will first hand it over to Janine. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalie. And I just want to say thank you also to Marina and Addison for coordinating this event and all of the speakers who've been presenting this week as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can you all see that? Yes. Great. So my name again is Janine Chirios, and I'm an artist living and working in Western Massachusetts. And I'm excited to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been creating over the past year and my artistic process. So last March, when the pandemic began, the world as we know it came to an abrupt halt. But at the same time, the natural world here in New England was just beginning to awaken and unfurl from its winter slumber. During this uncertain time, I found solace in the daily walks around the neighborhood in the woods near my house. I observed flowers as they were coming into bloom, and I started to develop a mental map of where different plants were growing around my neighborhood. I started taking daily pilgrimages around the neighborhood as a way to counter the stress of the news that I was experiencing as we all were in daily life. And I really found great comfort in just seeing that the natural world was still thriving, even if everything else seemed to be falling apart. These walks continued throughout the year and really just gave me a sense of expansiveness and a place where I could think and breathe and just observe. So as I was walking, I started to think about these plants and flowers and wondered how I could embed their pigment into woven cloth. I've done quite a bit of work with natural dyes in the past, but always on silk fabrics. And suddenly I had this urge to dye yarn that I could weave with so that I could actually embed the color into the substrate of the cloth. And I began to wonder what palette could emerge from my local landscape. So soon my idea began to take shape, and by June, I was in full swing. I started to wrap the pre-mordanted yarn in bundles with flowers and plant matter and then steam them. And it was exciting to see what colors would emerge. I really enjoyed kind of the subtlety that this process picked up. It didn't take long for my curiosity to turn into a full-blown obsession. So my sunlit west-facing porch quickly became a laboratory of solar dye jar experiments. I developed a system of testing the dye first by leaving the plant water in the sun for a few days, along with a piece of pre-mordanted wool. if it was a successful dye, I would do a larger batch using the boiling water method. And I also specifically sought out plants that have been historically considered to be color fast according to the dye literature. Why not learn from the thousands of years of human history and ingenuity? As I always tell my students, you know, really up until the invention of synthetic dyes 170 years ago, all dyes were natural dyes. This process really gave me a sense of connection to the past. And I thought a lot about the Pecumtuck indigenous peoples that would have lived here in the Connecticut River Valley hundreds of years ago and wondered what plants are still growing here today. I was amazed to find how many plants that have been historically used for dye were here growing all around me. Staghorn sumac berries and leaves from the bike path, the field of goldenrod next to the cemetery, yarrow from the abandoned lot down the street, a field of black-eyed Susans next to a favorite swimming hole. A local palette was beginning to emerge. And here I'll highlight some of my favorites. The Queen Anne's lace has just always been one of my favorite flowers, and I was just so astounded to see that it gave such a vibrant yellow color, a color that I really just associate with summer. And I also was, you know, it's such a plant that's so ubiquitous that you just see everywhere that can create such intense color. And I started to really become enthralled with the little red floret that's in between a lot of the flower tops. And it's funny because, you know, I'm sure I knew about this, but somehow I had never noticed it before. And so I felt that this year for me was really about noticing. And when I started doing eco prints on paper, I loved that I got these little purple spots from those flowers. So I actually have a collection of these in the freezer right now for another kind of side project that I'm thinking about. But the goldenrod as well gave a really gorgeous warm yellow. And I loved how just these different tones of yellows were starting to emerge. Queen Anne's lace, goldenrod, and yarrow, I was starting to kind of think about as the three sisters of summer because they were all just giving such gorgeous yellows. And I loved how sometimes the results would be really unexpected. Like the black-eyed Susans, you know, you wouldn't look at this flower and think, oh, it's gonna make green, but it did. And so that was a really exciting surprise for me. And just seeing, you know, the different shades of green that would happen on the wool here or the lighter shade on the alpaca. And, you know, similar as well with the orange daylily, started to get some greens from that as well. And, you know, there are just so many variables that affect the color in natural dyes, whether it's the pH of the water that you're using, the mordant you're using, time of year, the amount of plant material and where it's grown. So I love that all of these factors and these histories are embedded into the color. And so as I started to think about these processes, I started branching out a little, and I started to include lichen, which is not a plant at all, but is actually an organism. It's an incredible symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungus. And, you know, some lichen can grow for hundreds of years. And so it's important to forage sustainably with lichen and only take what's fallen off of the substrate or the rock or the tree branch. So this was an exciting discovery as well, because I've dyed with ruffle lichen, but I've never gotten this orange before. And I really like these images next to each other because they're the inverse of one another. So you have the orange flower with the green dye, and then the green lichen that produces this orange color. So some of these unexpected surprises were really exciting to me. And then of course the chrysanthemums creating a warmer yellow going into late summer, early fall. And the staghorn sumac was a nice surprise to me as well, because I remember last year seeing these kind of crazy looking branches, you know, in March. with these berry kind of dried berries falling off and wondering like, what is that? What is that? And come to find out it's staghorn sumac, which is really high in tannins, which makes it an excellent plant to dye with. And so with an iron postmortem, I was actually able to get black. So it really just, these berries gave some light pinks all the way through tans and black. And then the leaves give a really vibrant yellow as well. So a lot of discoveries along the way, and just starting, to think a lot. I wanted to include this one because pokeberry, as you probably know, is a toxic plant. And so it is important to be careful what you're working with and learn about the plants. And again, just because something is natural doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. So with the pokeberry, I wore gloves and only worked outside using the solar dye jars. But the other thing about pokeberry is it's a very fugitive color. So it's not going to last. And this was the only plant I used that with the knowledge that it would be fugitive, but I couldn't resist. There was so much of it around the neighborhood where I live that I just wanted to try and see what would happen. But I actually found my true source for magentas and purples in the Umbilicaria rock tripe lichen. This was during a hike with a friend in central Massachusetts. I was really excited to see an abundance of this rock tripe lichen that actually I had been looking for years. I've read, from natural dyers that if you do the 3-month ammonia water ferment with the rock tripe lichen, you can actually get these vibrant magentas and purples. So I did that, and every day I aerated the jars and shook them up. So there was kind of a tending process there. But at the end of the 3 months, I got these beautiful colors. And so that was a really exciting process. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer refers to Umbilicaria as the belly button of the world because of its ancient history and the part of the organism that anchors to the rock that has a resemblance to the umbilical cord. And actually in Asia, it's known as ear of the stone. So just starting to find all of these incredible plants and organisms. And the walnut hulls gave such a rich brown. It's interesting to note too that it's not the actual nut, but it's the hulls that you use in dyeing. And that as you cut the shell open, or the hull open, you see that this kind of off-white color. And as it oxidizes, it turns this deep brown. And that's actually these pieces that are broken up and then used in the dye pot. And the smell and the kind of sensory experience of this process was a large, exciting part of it as well. And then of course, acorns, some more ranges of browns. The darker one here was using an iron mordant. And then I went back again to the eco-printed bundles, and this time using the plant matter that I was finding in the fall. So back to the walnut hulls and leaves and mums and different flowers and plants that I was finding on my walks. And I love the kind of the variegated yarn, but this process of dyeing yarns through the seasons and finding new materials as the year went on was really exciting for me. A large part of this project for me has actually been about archiving and documenting the process. And I've been struck with this sense that basically anything that happens this year is somehow very important because it's been such a historic year. So I've been saving the remnants of the dried dye stuffs in jars and have a whole collection of them now. In addition, as a sort of corollary to this project, this year I've been making a pressed plant journal, collecting and pressing dried plants from walks over the past year and just jotting down notes about where I found the plant, characteristics of the plant, what was happening personally in that moment in my life, and even globally and politically. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of plants and nature as witness, and as us as nature, or as witness to nature. The idea that somehow, if on an individual level, we become more aware of this as a personal relationship we can begin to have an impact on the current climate crisis as we think about our impact on the environment. And as I've been organizing and archiving the results of the dies, it occurred to me that this desire for looking for a sense of order just seems to make sense after such a chaotic year. So I was really interested in, just keeping track of how all of the colors were achieved and how the plants expressed the color, what mordants were used, how long I did each process. So that documentation became very important to me. And I really had battled a lot of doubts during this process. I was thinking, like, what if the yarns don't look good together? What if I don't have enough colors? What if I run out of yarn? But this voice in my head just keeps saying, just keep going, you'll have what you need. And in January, I pulled the Umbilicaria lichen from their 3-month ammonia ferment, completing the last color of the dyed yarn. The day I wrapped all of the weft colors together on a swatch, I cried. Something about seeing all of the colors together was very powerful for me. Each one had a memory and a place. In January, I brought my loom down to the living room to be able to sit next to the fireplace and weave. And I joke that this year I'm doing an art residency in my living room. I actually restarted the weaving several times before I felt what I wanted. It was what I wanted, but I finally got going in earnest last month. And the thing that I both love and find so frustrating about weaving is the fact that you can only control what's right in front of you in the moment. You can't go back and change what you've already woven, and you can't see what's yet to come. You can really only be in the present moment. And it really seems like a poignant metaphor, especially this year. And I kept thinking of this quote by Rilke: "She who reconciles the ill-matched threads of her life and weaves them gratefully into a single cloth." And I have that taped to my loom there as I'm weaving. But and I've also been thinking of this idea of weaving in relation to the tradition of landscape painting. Only here, the local pigments have been embedded into the substrate of the canvas or the cloth. So my plan now is to weave a panel that approximates my physical dimensions in space. So it will be 5'2" and a quarter tall. And now I'm about 3/4 of the way through. And I've just loved this process of dyeing the yarn in the summer and weaving with it in the winter. And for the first time in my life ever, I actually want winter to be longer. As it turns out, I have way more yarn than I need, and I keep coming up with ideas for smaller pieces and studies related to the project. I figured that this dyed yarn will sustain me creatively for at least the rest of 2021 and maybe longer. After this year, I'm hoping to self-publish a book based on the project and to put together an exhibition. There's been something really hopeful to me about weaving with the yarns of summer and seeing the goldenrod on the loom, remembering the field in summer. And as I look out my window today and weave, I can see what I know will come back as the field of goldenrod again, and soon it will start all over again. So thank you so much. And I just wanted to share a few of the resources that have been really instrumental to me this past year. Wild Color by Jenny Dean. It's a great resource, as well as The Art and Science of Natural Dyes by Joy Butrup and Catherine Ellis, written by both a scientist and an artist. And then of course, Lichen Dyes by Karen Castleman has been a great resource. So I just wanted to emphasize too that it's important to learn the basics about natural dyes and mordants, so you learn how to work safely and sustainably. Also, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer is an incredibly inspiring and fascinating book. So thank you so much. And thanks for joining me today. Let me stop the screen share here.
Thank you so much, Janine. And I think as opposed to doing questions now, we may, I've been taking notes of the questions that are coming in through the chat. So maybe we can move on to and do the rest of the presentations now and then have a lovely chat with everybody who's here.
So are you ready for me? Okay, I'm going to share my screen too.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Beverly.
Okay, well, I loved your presentation, Janine, and we are all of such a complete kindred spirits. And I know both Lisa and I have talked about braiding sweetgrass as our Bible and so forth. So it's certainly very close. So I'm going to introduce, Lisa and I put this together, and I'm going to introduce it, and then she's going to speak, and then we'll come back to me. And so, and it seems like a very good order to do that, because I think Lisa's work is quite closely akin to the project you were just listening to, the beautiful poetic way you approach that. And then mine is rather different, but underneath it all is the same kinship. So what I will just say by words of introduction was, in thinking about the theme of this conference about home. So what do we think of with the idea of home? It's comfort and safety and familiarity. It's a place we know intimately. It's where we belong. So what's happening with the presentation that Lisa and I are doing is positing an expanded concept of home related to textiles, and this intimacy and familiarity, as we heard from Janine, extends to the local outdoor environment. And when we work closely with those materials of particular places and incorporate them, whether it's as dye stuffs or printed images or fabrics or additive elements, we come to know those places in different ways, very deeply. So our home, our sense of home, expands beyond the walls of our literal houses, and we're at home in the environment, and our sense of love and belonging actually extends outward. And then these natural elements literally become part of the textiles we make, so that they are then in those textiles, and our sense of family extends to those pieces. So I was just, sorry. I just want to say that many aspects of this relationship with the materials of the near environment bear close examination, because we're touched on so many levels emotionally in that expanded sense of belonging, intellectually in that we become very attuned to the workings of nature and a scientific understanding of materials and why they act the way they do, and aesthetics, certainly, as we're steeped in the natural forms and the colors and the textures, and spiritually on every level. So we really come to know our place on earth in a very deep way, and we are part of that natural world. It's not just that there's nature and that there's us, we are nature. But this is a way of accessing that sense of home in the bigger world. So we actually come to know how many beings, the vast array of plants and animals, share the home with us, and we develop that sense of reciprocity with the land. We take care of it as it takes care of us, as Janine was saying. And we develop that more cyclic sense of time with the seasonal and weather cycles, as all of us are speaking about. And we slow down as we go through all the many preparatory steps or processes with our materials that take time. So when we interact with the finished pieces, those associations, as we've seen, are in this tangible form. And it's a real vital relationship, because the very sunlight that fed those plants the nutrients that came up through its roots are actually in there. And the yard waste is transformed into color and texture. And the detritus, which is part of what I work with, which you'll hear about, it just becomes part of us in a very deep way. So the idea of working with the materials of one's environment is certainly nothing new. It's millennia. People have processed fiber and extracted color, and they've come to know the properties and the possibilities of the natural world. And this familiarity, this close relationship was a given. It was a matter of survival. The indigenous sense of home until the industrial era perhaps was not limited to an architectural structure. It was a particular habitat, a bioregion or ecosystem. There was trade, but goods brought from other environments, I think, were almost always additive. They were special because of their rarity, but they were not in essence part of the family. So I've literally been awestruck for so many years by how deep the relationship with the environment could go. Think of the way that the Inuit and other circumpolar people knew how to work with the animals in their environment to turn walrus intestine to a pliable material for waterproof parkas, for example, to make socks out of bird skins, or to process and sew fish skin into containers, as you can see here, or even whole clothing, full body suits. Other people used grasses and related materials on the lands that they lived to weave structures that could be used for all kinds of purposes, to hold and carry your most precious family members, babies, or to transport you over water. And they were tight enough also to hold water, even baskets. And so this is all a part of the integral nature of what is one's home. If you're cooking outdoors in the basket that you made, that's part of the home as much as anything inside. So I could go on and on about this. It's one of my deep passions, the relationship with materials. But that's not exactly the topic. The industrialization did change the world irreversibly, and there's probably nowhere on Earth now that doesn't have access to at least some manufactured materials. And we all know how far removed we are from textile manufacture or textile materials, but there's still that hunger, the yearning to belong to the natural world, and it's artists now who can explore that relationship. So as we know, there's this new appreciation for discovering about plants through botanical printing and dyeing, or exploring what a basket can be. And certainly, while you can go far afield for your materials, the most meaningful ones are those that are developed close to home. So as we've seen, the gathering and processing becomes part of the pattern of one's days, and we don't need a pandemic for that to be true. That's just really foregrounded it. So it's the hominess of home. It's the sense of belonging. And at the same time, as Janine made clear, it yields constant surprises and gifts. So the rest of this session will be listening to two other artist talks, one from Lisa Binkley and then me. And our work is very different, but we do share the sense of discovery and that expanded sense of home. So we will each tell our own story. Lisa first, and I invite you to just breathe in and share our sense of connection and belonging.
Great, thank you, Beverly. And here, let me go ahead and share my screen. And get the slideshow. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, actually, sorry, I'm going to try to, I want to, oh, sorry about that. I'm getting this, I want to share this, but I'm trying to adjust my Okay, I guess I'm not able to do that. So anyway, thank you, Beverly and Janine, for what you have shared. And it feels like being in a group of kindred spirits, which is awfully nice. But what I wanted to do in my presentation is just talk a little bit about this expanded sense of home and my botanical printing and dyeing and how I do it and what it means to me. I'm living in Madison, Wisconsin right now, but I grew up in suburban Chicago, and home to me was my house and my yard, certainly, but also community and neighborhood. And then we spent a lot of time visiting my grandparents in rural Wisconsin and rural Colorado. And it was also what we got to see and play with there and in those spaces. So we would come in, say hello to our grandparents, and then run out the door and play outside and make believe homes for ourselves there. But we would do that, and we would constantly be dissecting plants and plant materials and just exploring those. During the pandemic, so later on, after I grew up and was in a home of my own, I travel quite a bit for teaching botanical printing and dyeing workshops. But this past year, like everybody else, I was home a whole lot more. And one of the things I have wanted to do for quite a while was to grow a vegetable garden. So we set up 2 of these 4-foot by 8-foot raised beds and planted lots of tomatoes and herbs and peppers. And I knew that marigolds were good at helping to keep critters away from your plants. So I planted 5 different shades of marigolds around the beds of our edibles, and really enjoyed the fragrance and the colors from them. And then what I would do is, as I saw a flower droop, I would pick it and put it in a big Ziploc gallon bag and freeze it, and ended up with maybe 5-gallon bags of marigold flowers that I could use for making dyes. At the end of the season, then I collected those and made dyes from them in a whole range of colors. One of my practices also is working with collecting weeds, things that are invasives, whether it's buckthorn or dandelions. So each year I probably spend a couple of weeks in the spring going out and picking any dandelion that's showing yellow at all, whether it's just a little bud or it's a fully open flower. I do that partly to be a good neighbor, because I don't want to spray my yard to kill the weeds, but I also don't want to be one of those neighbors with hundreds of dandelions, blooming and blowing around into the neighbors' yards. So I go out, and it's a great way to just get intimate with my yard, pick these flowers. I use them fresh or I freeze them, but I get really spectacular color. So it was fun to hear Janine talking about these colors of summer. And I very much felt the same way, that there's something really special about these bright yellow flowers. It's usually in May, which is kind of before a lot of the blooming season in Wisconsin. And they smell kind of nice when they're cooking too. And then if you add iron, as Janine talked about as well, you can get these deeper kind of olivey tones. There's a wonderful quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson that says, "We are but condensed light," that everything in the world is condensed light. And I love that idea that plants soak up rain and they soak up sunshine, and they make the stalks and the leaves and the flowers and the fruits. And then when I collect those and make them into a dye, I am pulling out some of that sunlight and then imbuing it into the wool or silk or cotton fabrics that I use. So 2 of my favorite yellows of the summer are dandelions and marigolds, and also goldenrod. But I look at them and I see this sense of sunlight that has been soaked into them. And this quilt in the middle is just an example of the pale yellow. Up in the top is a panel of cotton that I dyed with some of my dandelion dye. And then there are also indigo dyes in here as well. I do like that I can use these plants either fresh or frozen. I also really like celebrating plants not only that are, blooming and sort of in the youth or the fullness of their life, but things that are kind of nearing the end of their lives. And whether that's an old torn crumbly leaf that I print with, or this birch tree that happens to be in our yard, and there was a branch that fell off probably decades ago. So in that little hole that you see, it collects rain, and I discovered that I could go and scoop the liquid out of that hole and make dye from it. So the pink fabric that you see down at the bottom was actually dyed from the liquid in the hole in the tree. The other was some of that same dye, but with some iron added to it. And I loved the different shades. And I loved the idea that these fabrics are being dyed from the heart of the birch tree. I think I told Beverly that I've also taken some fabrics and crammed them into that hole to let them soak up pigment as well. But it's that embracing the wabi-sabi of life, of things that are beautiful throughout their whole life cycle. One of my favorite yellows is a yellow that I get from milkweed, which is a native prairie plant in Wisconsin, but it's also the favorite food source and primary home for monarch butterflies that are endangered. And so what I do is I wait until the very end of the season when it's starting to get cold. So really after they're, usually this green, but when I know the monarchs have hatched, they've eaten what they need to, they have flown south, and then we'll collect the stalks and the leaves and create a dye with it that's just very soft, creamy yellow that I don't find that I get from other types of plants. So I always find myself a little bit nervous about recommending using milkweed, but I'd say if you do it, on into November, when we know that the monarchs are gone, then it's a pretty safe bet. And these pictures just show some before and afters of some whiter wool and some more creamy colored wool dyed with those. As I'm home and I'm cooking and doing things to prepare meals for my family, I do like to collect materials that I know will make a fairly durable dye. There are a lot of foods that people like to dabble with for dyes that aren't very long lasting, but onion skins are pretty long lasting, and pomegranate skins have lots and lots of tannins in them. So they make probably one of my very favorite dye sources. So on the picture on the left, you can see the jars of yellow and red onion skins that I'll save just as I'm peeling onions to cook dinner. I love to get pomegranates in the winter time and have them on my oatmeal for breakfast. And then I use my old radiator in my studio to dry the skins. And then I can keep these for years and make nice batches of dye that are this beautiful sort of a soft golden yellow through deeper golden brown, depending on the quantity of pomegranate skins I use in relation to the fabric that I use. And it dyes beautifully on wool and silk and cottons. So probably one of my favorite things to do is my big fluffy dog that was mentioned in my intro. She and I go for walks pretty much every day around our neighborhood, and I love that we live in a very wooded neighborhood. And so I will frequently be seen walking the dog home, and then I'll have a handful of leaves that I have collected along my walks. If there was a heavy rain the day before, I find that I will bring a bag with me and then collect leaves that have fallen and bring those home and use those in my studio. Probably my very favorite type of leaf to use is a white oak. I love their curved lobes. I love the way they look, almost like a human form that looks kind of joyful or celebratory. And so I find myself returning to these again and again. I find that I also look for leaves that have kind of a curved central vein line. To me, they feel like they're dancing. There's a playful movement to them. And then I use them for printing on all different types of natural materials. Probably my second favorite type of leaves that are really abundant in my area is maple leaves. I know a lot of people think of silver maples as kind of a scrubby or weedy tree, and I think they just have some of the prettiest leaves I've seen. It's a very elegant form, so I like to use that a lot. Japanese maples are also wonderful, and I have planted a fair number of things in our yard over the years that are good for printing and dyeing. But I've planted some Japanese maples, and then I love the little seeds, the little samaras that come off of the maple trees. And I have found some pretty delightful prints I've gotten printing with those. The images on the right, the bottom was actually the cotton fabric that went on top of the image on wool on the upper right. So you can see how you get that. It's so in botanical printing is referred to as the blanket, but I find that the blanket material often ends up being just about as beautiful as the primary material. The picture toward the bottom left was also a blanket from another print. I also find, in addition to collecting materials from foods, is repurposing things like tea bags. So even after you've made tea with the bag, there's still quite a bit of tannin left in the leaves. And I really love that sort of soft, creamy color that the tea makes on white fabric. I love that line that's left when you put a tea bag down on fabric, it's wet, and then let it completely dry. In the picture on the far left, you can see where I used tea bag and some little rusty objects, and I have some more pictures of that later on. But taking something kind of as everyday as tea bags in your home and using those as part of my printing process. And then when I work those fabrics into some of my fiber art pieces, I will do quite a bit of hand stitching with hand-dyed threads that I've created. So here's some more pictures of using the tea bags. And when we bought our home, it was about 80 years old, and we bought it from the family who had built the house. So there were some interesting things left behind. One of those was a cabinet with some hardware in it that had screws and nuts and bolts, most of which were kind of rusty. But what I discovered is the combination of the rust and the tannins from tea bags made these beautiful grays and blacks. So I took a container that had apples in it. I think I got at Costco, and it had these interesting sort of half circles or half spheres cut away. And by placing fabric in there and putting a few of the little rusty bits from the basement, and then some tea leaves, and then pouring some vinegar and water over it, I could get these really beautiful patterns on old vintage linens. So the pictures all across the bottom are different kinds of fabrics that I have dyed using those little rusty pieces of hardware. I also had a next door neighbor who for a long time would collect her hibiscus flowers from her garden and bring them over to me, which was lovely. As part of my sense of wanting to repurpose things, whether it's skins of plants or rusty pieces of hardware, I also am really interested in vintage linens and the whole history of women and women's work and these beautiful time-consuming objects that then often end up given away to thrift stores when the family no longer wants it. So I do find that a couple times a year I'll go to thrift shops and look for old pieces of vintage linens, like the lace. It's actually a collar that's cropped in the middle picture. I've got old worn pieces of a chair cover that was from my own home on the left. That was a linen seat that I then stitched into one of my quilts with some indigo dyed silk behind it. But this idea of taking old fabrics and taking the beauty of the stitching that primarily women did with it, and then giving them a second life with botanical dyes and printing and in my fiber work. The last 6 images I've got are all of my art quilts that I've made, incorporating my botanical printing and dyeing and things that I've collected or things that I have had at home. In this piece, there's indigo dye on scraps of silk. The upper panel is a vintage men's handkerchief that is printed with rust and eucalyptus leaves, and then elk antler buttons that a friend gave me, and the little red turtles tucked under the silk that another friend had given me. So I love a piece like this that pulls together gifts from friends. The little lace doily was from a friend way back in high school when she went to Austria with the high school choir, and pulling together materials that I have dyed and printed, things I've found around my neighborhood, special objects that I've been given that I have at home, and using them to create a one-of-a-kind art piece. This one is also using some repurposed fabrics. It was a vintage linen damask tablecloth that I dyed first with rust and then with hibiscus flowers from my next door neighbor, and then incorporated processes of Nuno felt and drawing with ink and hand stitching with some lace trim that I had picked up just at Joann Fabrics, and then various beads I've collected over the years. lot of my early fiber art was very, very heavily beaded. And I still love working with beads and that really millennia old tradition of working with beads. But I have for several years now been combining the love of botanical printing and dyeing with working with embellishment and beadwork. These pieces, I typically don't like to use foliage that's not from my home area, with the exception of eucalyptus that's just so beautiful and prints so beautifully. But I have found, like the pieces on the piece on the right, there are some vendors at the farmers market in downtown Madison in the summer who will grow eucalyptus as an annual. And so I can pick up bundles of it there. So I still feel that connection to my home community and things that are grown here, and then printing on wool. And in the case of the piece on the left, the background fabric was a remnant of some upholstery fabric that I dyed in a real light walnut dye and then folded and clamped and worked with indigo. And again, taking those bits and pieces of scraps of fabrics and giving them a new life and kind of a new purpose. I've been working on a series that I call my Forest Blanket series, and it's taking pieces of wool, flannel that I just love to work with. It absorbs botanical dyes so beautifully. And so I will print and dye with the mordanted wool fabric and then piece them together by machine and then quilt them by hand. So there's a lot of hours of hand stitching in here and really loving the fabrics and embellishing with both beads and embroidery threads. This one's about, I'd say 42 inches wide by about 28 inches high. And it's got a mix of catalpa leaves, which are those great big leaves in the upper right and the top kind of just left of center. Catalpa seed pods also really print beautifully. So I have a big stash of those in my dye shed that I have collected walking around the neighborhood. And then maple leaves and onion skins and a variety of plant materials I've collected on my walks with my dog. This piece is about 48 inches wide, and it's called Remembering Summer. And it really does make me think about summer and the colors of summer, from the milkweed dyes and marigold dyes, and then interesting things that happen with elderberry that I use to create dye, but then you can see the kind of turquoisey area up in here. I put some lemon slices on it, and then the citric acid from the lemon turned this beautiful sort of gray lavender into kind of a teal blue. And there's just those delightful things that Janine had mentioned. There's so many variables when working with botanical prints and dyes that you just keep coming up with unexpected colors. In this, I also dyed silk threads that I had from way back in college when I was weaving a lot. And I put those in the pots with the botanical dyes so that the hand stitching that went on in here was part of that same palette of colors that I had dyed on the wools. This is a really large quilt that I have in progress right now that I'm, at least for now, calling Forest Clearings. It's about 70 inches wide and 100 inches high. And it's taking lots of these botanical printed and dyed cotton fabrics, most of which were actually the blanket on top of the wool, but piecing it together with madder dyed and indigo dyed strips. And I have been having just a delightful time. This is one of my pandemic projects. So I started piecing it back in the fall, and I'm now in the process of hand quilting the whole thing, but really celebrating the lines from the leaves, the different little variations that happen through the printing process. And by hand quilting it, I'm getting time, lots of time to spend with each of the pieces of fabrics. So thank you very much for having me here. And I've enjoyed giving this talk.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And we're turning back to Beverly, right?
Yes. Well, thank you. I always just get so excited seeing these things. Just beautiful. So I'm going to go back to very different kind of work, but I will start by saying that I've been dealing with this kind of sojourn that both Janine and Lisa have talked about for many decades. I worked in the 1970s at Hancock Shaker Village, and I can still, so I have a image of a field of Coreopsis that we grew there. And I can still smell it. I can still feel it. It's like 50 years ago. And I'm just saying it's so deep inside. It's not just the immediacy, but the longevity of that. And I felt so at home there, perhaps more than in houses I've lived in. And I also do some dyeing with materials from my environment, but given the kind of work I'm doing, it's often applied to bones, which are the same protein as wool, and other natural detritus. So you can kind of see both bones and these are kelp stems on this figure that were done in black walnut. And I incorporate cloth and fiber techniques in my current work, but I don't typically create textiles in the traditional sense. My muse is led to these three-dimensional sculpture or sort of semi-dimensional collage, and all of it has a textile sensibility, textile materials, techniques, the knowledge, and so forth. So you'll just be seeing some of these. So most of the pieces are built around elements I pick up from environments around my homes. So originally was the Midwestern landscape that, well, originally even before that, the Massachusetts landscape that Janine talked about, then the Wisconsin landscape, and now more recently the Gulf Coast of Florida. So you'll get a sense of how those work. And then this one has the one on the left has emu eggshell, but that also came from a local person at the farmer's market who was raising emu. But these are pumpkin stems, for example, dyed also. And those were right from my neighborhood after Halloween. And other things in the environment include deer, which I've worked with. I'm not going to go into that at length, but you'll get a sense of having to learn to how do you do that. And so there's certainly been a big learning curve about everything, and it just makes your curiosity go everywhere. And so really learning about deer, these are deer toes. And there's a sense of curating that comes with learning. I boiled those all down from different deer that I was able to get during hunting season from the people who process them. And so these are deer bones on here. This one was actually from an old sweater of mine. This is a pumpkin stem. So you can just see how these things kind of come together. And this is very small sculpture, just maybe 6 inches tall. And more bones. Bones they find me now as well as me finding them. And sometimes I don't know what they are, and sometimes I do. So a few stories. So I lived for 40 years in Madison, and most of that time right by a small lake that I really came to know very, very closely. So it was my figurative backyard, not quite my literal backyard, but I spent many, many hours seasonally on the lake and got to know its moods and its inhabitants and so forth. So one of the things, for example, that I would do when I was in a kayak was I would find these little, very fragile, small snail shells. Well, these are the bodies of, the shells from the bodies were sometimes still in. This was on the right, you see 1 day's worth of collecting from the weeds in the kayak. And things like that I came to know where to look for them and what they were like and what they smelled like and so forth and so on. And then they would become incorporated in some of these figures. So in this particular case, you're seeing the row of there's 2 of those different kinds of snails and one of the kinds there and another kind of bone. Or in addition to those shells, there are freshwater clams in Lake Wingra. It's harder to find them now because the weeds make it very hard to see them. And I would never take a living clam, but there would be sometimes shells. And so just learning how to find those. And after many years of spending many, many hours on the lake, I discovered that would had never been there before, and I don't know how they appeared or why, but there were lotuses for the first. There had always been many water lilies, but then what lotus started growing, and that's actually considered invasive and somewhat um, worrisome because it can spread so much, although it seemed to have been checked after a while. But that was really exciting. So I was able to collect the pods from the flowers, and they became a material used in many ways. So you could see like the whole pod or pieces of it that were worked into different pieces. So these are, each one of these is a long story, which I'm just giving flavors of. And certainly, and there was some naturally dyed wool that I had done years and years ago, or just using pieces of wood that were picked up. You just get a sense of whatever was there became part of what I'd started looking for and so forth. But I have a very different environment that for years I was living seasonally in Madison and seasonally in Florida. And now I no longer have a house in Madison. I still have a home, but my environment is very different. It's semi-tropical. It includes the beach, which is just down the road, and all sorts of tropical plants. So it's been a whole new adventure. And even in, I knew one environment so well, and then to really come to know another one, I think keeps me young, literally. So you can see there's many birds from here. And so there are sculptures, of course, that wind up using actual parts of those birds often. And there's always, of course, just things that I find sometimes on the beach. And just learning how to process these is all a part of that. Or palms. And so here you're seeing some of my collages, and these are parts of palms or parts of palms here. Or I live at a beach that has fossilized shark's teeth, so there's some of those as well. And more palm, and there's so many kinds of palms, and just learning about palms, and they do make a big mess because they keep dropping things, but those dropping things are gold as well. So you get a sense of some of the things that I play with. Or this one, so these are philodendron sheaths, and they're all over, and these are jacaranda pods. And so just a sense of seeing everything in the environment with new eyes is part of what makes it so exciting to learn this whole environment. So my sense of home spreads. And as I say, a lot of it is from things on the beach, and horseshoe crabs have long interested me, very prehistoric kind of animal. And I've been, and they're they have very sharp, spiny things on them, but particularly the things that look like tails, which are not technically called tails, have been pretty interesting in so many ways. And here's again another image of curation, just playing with them, and then ways to use them. And they're endlessly interesting. And this again is a bird skull. And then there's handmade paper. I do consider paper an extension of the fiber sensibility, and playing with it and sculpting it too. And crabs, of course, there's so many crabs, and felt. And this piece is part of a gourd that's covered with dyed gut. And that would be pig gut, the kind of thing you use for sausage casing. Again, these were textiles that I made or wore. And more examples of crabs and other things that are found, slightly colored in this case for the sand dollar. These are very small again, but I love the spiraling and the coiling, and it always draws me in. And so they become, and then I begin to know what some of the crabs are. I often find little pieces of shells and have learned what their parts are and how to collect them. So this piece that I call Calling the Moon, these are it's like the strongest part of the clam that begins to break up when it's been knocked by the surf is the hinge, and the hinge becomes very expressive part of the clam. And little tiny things from the beach, including barnacles and flower petals from my yard. So similar ideas, but often work this way. And this is a shot of a house before I bought the house that I live in, I was renting a house and got this table to just work with. And one year there was a red tide, which is an algae bloom, which is very bad. It's actually kills off a lot of fish. But for me, it brought all kinds of materials to the beach. And so I really began to play with them, including so many fish bones and little fish heads, and learning how to process those and work with them was, again, another adventure. And I'm not squeamish about any of these things anymore because I've really learned how to work with them. So these little fish heads became part of many things, including this, which is actually embroidered. Or they become part of a sculpture. These are little fish heads as well. But it's a wand. That particular kind of fish is a bigger fish called a sea robin. But you get the idea. And you can see I work in a messy place, but I'm always collecting and trying to organize. So that curation is another part of it, which is really fun in a way, and it's never ending because as soon as you take things out, you have to figure out where they are again. But just to see that that's what really stimulates me is the materials themselves, and all the stories and all the life that was in them. You know, these were critters, these were living things, and in some way I'm giving them another life. This was something I found after that red tide year. I've not seen them since, but a cowfish is a strange little fish with this very hard plated kind of skin, bony. And it's marvelous because it's like sacred geometry. So those little pieces are also sometimes worked into some of my work. So you can see it here, and these are the deer bones again, and fish vertebrae. So there's just a range of different materials. And fish tails from, again, some of those dead fish. So learning how to dry them out, that's borax. And then, so there are fish tails in this piece, and fish bones, and fish tails and shells in the one on the right, much finer fish tails than the other. And this shows you a little better view of the shark's teeth and fish tail and part of a crab. So you just get different things worked together. And this is the birds and the fish, which I feel are part of my beach, are very much often together. Although on the one on the right here, this is actually part of a deer bone, so it sort of snuck in there too. And turtle bones, I did do some of that botanical printing, so you can see a little of that. More botanical printing on these, including on paper. And that one is onion skins on the left. And you've seen this a little bit already, but I'm making a point saying that those two environments that I've spent so much time learning about do come together. So in this piece, these sort of arms were actually the roots of water lilies, which were incredibly full of water. It took like months and months to dry them out. And then a crocheted piece, but then it's a sea sponge. And in here, lotus pod with a seaweed. And these are parts of things from sea life. Let's just, without explaining in great detail, but a lotus pod. So they all come together. And these are back to my little lake winged shells and a bigger sea urchin. So I think you can certainly see that the materials engage me and delight me, endlessly learning more. But I do want to return, just as a conclusion, to the sense of place and feeling deeply at home in the environment. And when I think of home, and I can say that for the two people who just preceded me, it's the same thing. I don't just picture my house. The areas around it are my familiars. And over time, I've come to know them. I know the patterns. I know the way the light hits at different times. I know the nooks and crannies. And the trees and the creatures and the plants of these environments are literally part of my extended family. So we have so much more to draw on, and such a richer family life, home life, when that becomes alive to us. So I thank you for your attention, and I have a website with more of this work, although it really needs updating. It's sorely out of date, but you can find it if you're interested. Thank you.
That was so terrific. Thank you all so much. I think we'll certainly be seeing our homes and our environments with new eyes, as you said, Beverly. We have a few questions. The first one is from the chat, and it's a question to Janine. It's from Charity, who asks, what books would you recommend to learn about which plants to use? And I think you answered this in part with your...
Yeah, in fact, let me add it to the chat. Jenny Dean, Wild Color, I'll put them in the chat just so that you can see them. But there are a number of really great resources that I'll include. Wild Color by Jenny Dean, Art and Science of Natural Dyes. So yeah, I'll add these in here.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And we also got a question in the Q&A for Lisa, and this is a question from Leslie Nelson, who's asking, can you please tell us about the piece behind you, which looks pretty amazing.
Thank you. So this is, I think, one of the last images that I showed is the piece called Remembering Summer, and it's a little bit brighter than it looks. I've got some pretty intense lights shining on it right now. So it's just all different pieces of wool, machine pieced together and then hand stitched with, I think I talked about elderberry dye that I had made and milkweed. There's onion skin, and then some places where and walnut, and then places where I did some modifications with citrus, and also with walnut. So that's what that is. I'm just trying to, so the two books that you had mentioned are my two favorite books. The Wild Color and then the Art and Science of Natural Dyeing are just fantastic. But thanks.
Wonderful. I think that, well, that we have so many comments that are just really effusive and thanking everybody. And I'm so glad that this is being recorded, because there's so much interest in it. It's clear that so many people are really excited about this work. I was curious if you had any questions for each other. I know that Lisa and Beverly work together, but and now that you've given the presentations, I was curious if there were any new ideas that came up, or you noticed anything new.
Well, I had a question for Janine, because I love hand stitching, and I was so blown away seeing the yarns that you wrapped, and then you got the variegated color. And so this is sort of more of a process question, but in terms of if somebody wanted to do that, what would you recommend about how to approach getting that really wonderful mottled color?
Well, so I definitely had, you know, some that were more successful than others. Sure. I found that it was most successful when I used wool, specifically alum mordanted wool. And, you know, just working with different plants that I knew I could probably get some sort of color from. Sure. So a lot of it was trial and error too, you know, and I just did the same way I would do bundles if I were doing like silks or other fabrics. Yeah.
But it's definitely something I want to try now after.
Yeah, yeah. I'd always kind of thought in the back of my mind as I was doing fabrics, like, oh, why couldn't I just do this on yarn as well and just see what would happen? So,
Yeah. Well, it looks great. It's really
thanks.
nice.
Yeah.
We have some more questions coming in. One is, excuse me, one is a question for Beverly. Ellen Adams is asking, do you see a connection between your work and the 19th century fashion for making items for the home from natural materials? Which is a great question. I'm looking forward to it.
Great question. And of course, that's always fascinated me. I liked looking at seaweed albums and things made out of lobster claws. So by all means, there's a relationship. I mean, I don't think my interest in it is exactly coming from fully the same place, because having learned about that, I think that was more scientific education and women's work. But absolutely, there were these great seaweed albums, some of which still exist, and in order to do that, you had to walk along collecting and learning about them. And then the same thing that happened to me, and they were more orderly than me. Maybe Janine the records are probably more orderly than mine. But the idea that it opens worlds, I think we do share, and I've been fascinated with that for a long time. Great question.
Beverly, I just loved seeing all of your collections in your studio. So beautiful.
There's lots more than that.
Well, and Beverly, as I was looking at the images of your work, I just love that the idea of the intimacy that you get to have with these objects that you're collecting and finding, and then the way that you transform them into something completely different from what they were, but they're still recognizable. I find that really delightful.
Thanks. One of the things I would add, so this work is ephemeral. I mean, if there are artists who make things and they're worried about whether they're going to last for hundreds of years. Well, this stuff is certainly not going to last for decades even, or some of it might, but a lot of it is so fragile. And that's part of it, I guess, because I'm giving some of those things more life, but not eternal life. and it's part of the whole interaction with it, is thinking about that too. I know that sometimes a lot of the things with bones, people don't always feel comfortable with. And I guess the reason is bones are associated with Halloween and death. But bones are a structure. They're amazing. And they're truly, is nothing inherently about death, about bones, so it's just interesting how we relate to each of those things. And some of it's learned behavior.
Well, I love this discussion. It's so great to have you all in conversation. We have another question from somebody in the Q&A section. This is more of a technical question for Lisa. And it's asking if you can explain how to get the dye out of maple leaves and then print them out.
So for really all the leaves that I use, it's kind of the same process where I'll take fabric, whether it's wool or silk or cotton or linen, but it has to be a natural fabric, and more that, which is preparing it so that it will hold dye well. So I use potassium alum sulfate if I'm dyeing silk or wool or printing on it, and then alum acetate if I'm using a cellulose fabric. And then I'll take the maple leaves, and depending on the time of year you collect them, you get different kinds of pigment and imagery. But so really probably fall and after fall is the best time. But just take the leaves and literally set them on the fabric. And then Janine has some nice pictures of these bundles. So you just roll it up really tight. You can use a stick, you could use a dowel rod. I use either a copper pipe or a rusty like metal pipe. And then the copper or the iron in the pipe will help to interact with the plant material, but the tannins will leach out of the leaf and create this beautiful detailed form. And then the tighter the bundle, the more crisp the print will be. But I'll steam those. So I'll roll up the bundle and tie it up with twine, or if I don't want the lines from the twine, I'll use an ace bandage, and I'll steam those for about an hour and a half. And the steaming process extracts the tannins from the leaves. And you can do that with dyed fabric. You can do it on top of fabric that you've dyed with botanicals as well.
Janine is just, I was so taken by your image of the Queen Anne's lace, because I just recently realized that those much darker colored florets exist in the
Yeah.
Was that the same technique that you used to?
Yeah, I used basically I took like a heavier paper, like a printmaking paper, and I bundled the plant material in between, and then used like pieces of wood, and then so basically it's the heat from the steam and also the pressure of those things being sandwiched together. I just used like a clamp to kind of clamp it. The wood made a little sandwich basically with the plant material and the paper and the wood, and then steamed that. And so got that imprint onto the paper. Yeah.
I want to share that Janine had the image of the jars getting in the sunlit window as tests to see if there'd be color, and Lisa had those wonderful jars on her radiator and in her kitchen. There's something so satisfying about seeing it too. I mean, it's collecting it, but it's the aesthetics of, I don't know if it's bounty or something about how many gifts there are in our environment. I'm not sure how to articulate it, but it was interesting to see that in both cases, and it affected me in both cases. That feels so good.
Yeah, there's kind of this thing of collecting, and something about the process. It is just so interesting. I think that I find it in my work, and I definitely see both you and Lisa Beverly as well, just that really process is it's all, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's something so homey about like taking jars and collecting things, and it kind of makes me think about like storing up for the winter, even if it's leaves. But I think there's just something very grounding and satisfying about doing that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that the audience has all kinds of other stories about these things too, which is too bad we don't get to hear them all.
Yeah. Actually, lots of comments from people about their own experiences in the landscape, and most recently, Amanda Wewell, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, said, thank you for 3 inspiring insights into your wonderful work. I also love those 2 books that I think Janine put into the chat. I've been working with my local plants during lockdown. I live near Manchester in England and have some plants the same and some very different. So it's really nice to see where everyone is, and I'm sure how being at home and being in lockdown has changed our own experience of working with these materials and being in the landscape.
I want to say, I don't know if anyone used the word intimacy. Maybe we did. I don't remember specifically, but that's a lot of what I think it is. It's an intimacy with materials, the cloth, the whatever.
I think that's part of what I love about this wool flannel that I use a lot too, is I just like to pet it. I love the way it feels. I love handling the plant materials, and there's just such a tactile quality to the whole process that's really delightful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved, Lisa, what you were talking about too, this idea of condensed light and the sunlight kind of being embedded in the fabric. I love that. So beautiful.
I just realized that we're just about at the equinox. So what a perfect timing for this.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a state of balance.
Yeah.
Beverly, you just teed me up to just remind everyone that tomorrow we have our quote unquote equinox craft sessions at various points throughout the day. And I was actually really inspired by the calendar in setting that up, because I thought, you know, when we're having this event where people are making things at home, but kind of having exchanges around the globe in this virtual manner, I really love the idea of sort of having equal daytime and nighttime regardless of where you were. And so it seemed like a really special day. So thank you for queuing me up for that reminder to everyone. And if people want to continue the conversation, you can still sign up on the Textiles from Home website and you'll get the Zoom link for any time tomorrow. There are kind of 3 blocks throughout the day that I hope will serve people in many time zones, probably not all time zones, but many time zones.
And I think probably all of the attendees already have this, but I just put the
Thank you.
From Home program schedule, the link to that in the chat, so everybody can sign up for those equinox events. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you especially to Lisa and Janine and to Beverly. And thankfully this event has been recorded and it will be going up onto I believe the Center for Design and Material Culture website.
Probably in the first instance on the Textiles from Home website, and then I think in due course on the CDMC one as well.
Great. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
And
Thank
thank you.
you all so much.
Yeah.
And thanks for such a great audience. We had a big crowd